If you're new to mixing and you feel at all confused about EQ or compression, or if you lack confidence in knowing exactly when and why to reach for these tools, well, this video is going to help clear that up and give you a very solid foundation. And the training you're about to see is taken straight out of my paid program, the Pro Production System, and it covers the foundations you need to know about all of your core mixing tools. So EQ, compression, saturation, distortion, and effects. And it's going to close in any final knowledge gaps that you still have, give you a lot of confidence in knowing when and why to use these tools, and put you in control over your gear and over your plugins. Here it is. All right, welcome to the first lesson of the Mixing Foundations module. I'm going to talk about your mixing weapons here, the main tools that you have in your arsenal as a mixer to accomplish what you want in the mix. Now, I want to remind you that your biggest light bulb moments from this whole PPS training are going to come from the full mix walkthroughs and the real-time mixes. But with that said, the newer that you are to mixing, the more you'll probably need to lay this foundation first. Because when you reach for one of these weapons that I'm going to talk about, you want to know why you're reaching for them. And you want to know when is the right situation to use each one, not just simply copying moves that you saw me or someone else make. So we'll lay the foundation here, but rest assured, inside those full mix sessions, I do explain the why and the thinking and the reasoning behind my moves as we're going. So there is definitely a lot of teaching in those videos, a lot of kind of real world, like in the trenches info in there. So if you feel confused about EQ or compression, saturation, etc., take these lessons in, but don't stop here because it really comes to life in the full mix walkthroughs. So your main weapons, your main tools in the mix. Number one is the fader, right? This should be obvious. You probably thought I was going to say EQ first, right? This should be obvious, but we definitely get carried away with all the plugins, right? All the other tools, the compressors, the saturation, the limiters, the multiband compression. We forget that sometimes you just need to turn something up or down. And in a sense, the fader is kind of like its own type of EQ for a mix. For example, if you turn up the cymbals in a mix, the overall mix is going to sound brighter. Likewise, I've found that sometimes the best way to get a fatter low mid-range is just to turn up the bass track. Now, of course, the fader is not enough on its own. I'm not going to be here preaching a minimalist approach to you where you just avoid all these other tools at all costs and try to only use a fader. That's not what I'm saying, but I just wanted to start here because you got to remember not to neglect the fader. And so many times, as I was coming up and learning all this stuff, I definitely went down the rabbit hole of fiddling with all this EQ and all these plugins and multiband compression with a bass track when all I needed to do in the end was just to turn it up a bit. So don't forget about the fader. Number two, the pan knob. Just as simple, right? This allows you to get stereo separation in the mix. And you'll see in my mixes, I don't really do much in between panning, right? I really am just mostly left, center, right. There are a few exceptions to that you'll see, but mostly left, center, right mixing. And the funny thing is if you want wide mixes, well, the counterintuitive secret is you actually need to have less things panned out wide and less things in between. Because it's not about just using widening plugins and panning a bunch of things hard left and right. It's about contrast. If you want it to sound wide, then there has to be more contrast. So that means more things panned up straight in the middle and then a few things panned out wide. That's what creates the contrast for a wide sounding mix. And that's why if you're someone who pans stuff all over in between in your mixes, and you have something panned out 20 and 30 to the left and right, and then something else 50% and something else 80%, your mix will actually start sounding more crowded and more narrow because you don't have that contrast. And real quick, I'll just kind of go through some things that you would typically have panned either center or left and right or in between. So up the middle, you typically have your kick, your snare, your bass guitar, lead guitar lines, synths, lead vocals, anything really playing a kind of a main melody line. You've got that up the middle. Panned out hard left and right, and I'm talking 100% left and right. Usually your two rhythm guitars, any guitar layers, maybe octaves or just kind of texture guitar layers, I like to pan out often as well. Auxiliary instruments, you might have some sort of percussion sometimes out wide, some type of synth if you want to get it away from the lead vocal, and background vocals. I like to have those doubled and panned out hard left and right. Now the things that you would maybe pan in between center and hard left and right, your toms to create kind of a realistic drum set image. Usually those are panned kind of halfway in between the left and right. And lead guitars too. Sometimes, instead of having them right up the middle, kind of fighting with the lead vocal, sometimes I'll pan them out, 20 or 30% to the left or right, or sometimes even less, just a little notch off, just to help give it a bit of separation. And then finally, we've got stereo source. So your stereo track would be panned hard left and right, but the way we hear it, it's captured with a stereo pair of mics, and so it's not sounding like completely separate left and right. There's a lot of overlap there, so it doesn't sound completely wide. It has more of just a natural stereo image. So that would be overhead mics, drum rooms, pianos, any synths that are stereo. And these are just natural stereo images, the way that we normally hear these types of instruments, and they kind of help to fill in the space in between your other tracks that are panned straight up the middle or hard out wide. Now, these are just basic guidelines, okay? These are not rules for panning by any means, but this is typically what you'd hear in a pop or rock mix. And in fact, the more radio ready, like the more kind of top 40, top 10 radio hits you'll hear, they often sound more mono. So that's your second weapon, the pan knob. All right, let's get into the fun stuff. Third weapon on the list is EQ. I can feel the excitement building now. All right, EQ is where you can change the frequency makeup of a sound, right? This is pretty powerful. You can add or remove bass frequencies, mid-range frequencies, and high frequencies, or, in the old car stereos, the bass, the mid, and the treble, right? We're all familiar with that. There are a few different types of EQs that you can use, a few different kind of tools and parameters on every EQ, and we're going to go deeper into that in the EQ Foundations lesson. Next, we've got compression, and I would argue this is the most powerful weapon of pro mixes. Compression controls the dynamic range. Okay, you can make things louder, you can stop peaks from poking out too much, and you can make things more audible consistently throughout a song. For example, if you've got an acoustic guitar player and you're miking him up, he's playing down low, big chords on the low strings, but then he goes way up high on the higher strings, higher up on the neck. Well, that's going to be quieter and level, right? And so maybe the low chords, the low strings, they sound too loud. The higher strings, they sound too quiet. A compressor can even that off so we can hear everything that the guitar is playing. So that's the basic function of a compressor. But as you'll see, it's really much more than that, because it allows you to shape the sound and control the energy and really the front-to-back depth of a mix in a way that no other tool can. And you're going to walk away from these lessons with a much better understanding of the power of compression. Next, we have saturation and distortion. Now, these add harmonics, and they also affect the dynamic range of a track. And look, you don't need to know the science of how saturation and distortion plugins or hardware tools actually work. I don't really know the science of how they work. But saturation is kind of just a subtle form of distortion, and it reacts based on what's there. So it reacts of what's coming into it, but then it adds more. It adds more to it in a complementary way. And because of that, it makes things sound bigger, more full. It's kind of like an octave or a chord on a piano or guitar, right? You have the root note, and then you add the third, then the fifth, then the octave, and each one you add is making it bigger, complementing that root note. It's kind of one way to think about it. And distortion is just saturation at the extreme end, right? Just think about a guitar distortion pedal. Now, when it comes to saturation, this can also be something that gently softens transients, or it can do it in a harder way, like distortion. And so it's definitely a dynamic control as well as a harmonic enhancer. And when it comes to knowing when to use saturation versus, let's say EQ to change the tone of something, well, think of it like this. I think of an EQ as really changing what the instrument sounds like, really changing the very tone, the very sound of the instrument, versus saturation. That's kind of just making it sound like more of what it already is. Taking what's there, helping it fill a bit more space, helping it to sound a little fuller and bigger, and it can also kind of shape the tone of a track in a more subtle and musical way than EQ sometimes does. And finally, your last mixing weapon is effects. This is reverbs, delays, harmonizers, choruses. These are things that add space, sometimes add depth to your mix. They help us make things sound more pleasing because it mimics the way our ears hear in real life. Any instrument, any voice that you're hearing in real life, it's always interacting with a space, right? It's always in a room. It's always in some type of environment. And so we hear reflections, we hear echoes. That's how our brains are used to processing sounds. And so when we're capturing or working with really dry or kind of directly captured tracks that aren't interacting with the environment, having these effects like delays and reverbs, it really helps us just generate a more pleasing, more realistic sound. Like a short delay that you'll see me using in all of my mixes on lead vocals just makes it sound like more of a person singing in a small room in front of us. It feels more natural than just having a really bone dry vocal with no ambience whatsoever. We don't hear that in our real lives, so that sounds very uncomfortable, sounds very out of place. But you put a short delay on, then it starts sounding like someone's singing in front of you in a small room. And of course, reverbs and delays, they can also add length and kind of a tail to sounds. So when it comes to effects, reverbs, delays, etc., I use them subtly, but it's just to make it feel more natural and not strangely cold and dry. And sometimes these effects are also more pronounced, like maybe a deliberately strange or kind of cool sound that you'd use just more as a texture or a creative flavor for the track. So these are your 6 main weapons in the mix. The fader and the pan knob, there's not much else to say there aside from just seeing those in action, but we're going to dive deeper into the other 4 a little more to keep building on your foundation. Let's talk about EQ. This is certainly going to be one of your most used tools in the studio along with compression. And remember, this is about changing the way something sounds in a potentially extreme way. EQ can do that, changing the very frequency makeup of a sound. So we'll talk about the different types of EQ here and when to use them. So first, let's break down the different frequency ranges and what they're good for so that you know kind of where to start looking when you're actually using an EQ. So first, 50 to 100 hertz. Now below 50, I didn't include that. It's kind of 0 to 50. We're usually not doing much there as mixers. Usually we're filtering that out. Even on a bass or a kick drum, I'm filtering out 40 or 50 hertz, sometimes even higher depending on the tuning of the track. What's down there is really just low-end rumble noise, kind of the rumble that's not useful. Okay, but from 50 to about 100 hertz, that's our sub-frequency range. I call it the sub-range. That's where we get the nice rumble. Those are the frequencies that we feel in our chest. You know, when you go to a concert and you feel that kick drum punch in your chest, or if you've got a nice subwoofer or sound system, these are the frequencies that you feel. So typically, we're really only focusing on these frequencies when it comes to kick drum, maybe a little bit on some toms, and bass guitar, and the odd synth track. Most of the time, other instruments, they don't really have anything useful for us in this range. All right, then up from 100 hertz to about 250, I call this kind of the low-end power range, because while we have that nice sub-rumble that feels great, you know, below 100 hertz, thing is, a lot of speakers, a lot of systems, they can't reproduce that powerfully, or maybe the speakers are in a space where those sound waves can't really develop properly, or they're bouncing around and canceling each other out. So that's why the low-end power, the low end that really translates everywhere across any listening environment, is more in the 100 to 200 hertz range. So you got to make sure that you're not cutting too much of that out. And this range can become boomy if you have too much of it, but make sure you don't lose all of the low-end power because you think the sub-frequencies are enough, or maybe you're mixing on some really bass-heavy speakers, or you've got a subwoofer so it sounds like your low-end is really powerful, but those low sub-frequencies, they might not translate that well. And if you've cut out everything between 100 and 200 or 250, then you'll end up with a really thin, weak-sounding mix. And in this range, I'm typically not boosting much here, usually not boosting a lot, except, you know, the classic 200 hertz boost on snare drum, which gives it a great weight. So it's not really so much about boosting this range, it's just about making sure you don't cut too much of it out. Okay, then we've got 250 to 500 hertz. This is where a lot of the fullness in your mix comes from. This is really the meat of your sounds. And if you have too much of this, yeah, your mix can sound muddy for sure. And that's why a lot of new mixers will instinctively just cut 300 hertz all the time on every track, because it kind of instantly sounds less muddy and more clear. But kind of like the range I just talked about, if you do that too much, your mix will sound very weak. It'll sound like it has a hole in the middle of it, and it will sound very thin. So similar to what I just talked about, this is another range where you're probably not going to be boosting a lot. That can tend to become really kind of muddy and woofy pretty quick, but the key is to make sure you don't cut all of it out and lose all the fullness and meat of your mix. From 500 to about 1K, this is also more of a range of fullness, just in a less powerful way than the lower frequencies. It's more in a harmonic and character way. 600 to 700, if you have too much of it, it's kind of a plasticky sound, and you'll find in small rooms, if you get too much of that 700 hertz area, it starts to sound like that classic kind of amateur basement quality. I don't know what it is, but usually in recordings that were tracked somewhere just in a bad room, Usually 700 hertz, there's way too much of it. It sounds kind of cheap and amateur. And then going up a little bit, 700 to 900, that's more of a honky mid-range sound. It's kind of like plugging your nose and talking, like kind of like this, or like a basketball bouncing, like a kick drum with too much 900 hertz. It sounds like a basketball being bounced on the ground. And so sometimes we've got to cut that out as well. And that also falls into this range that I've been talking about of these frequencies that you're typically not boosting very much. I like to use the fader instead to get more or less of these mid frequencies. Usually that works better, but more often you're going to be cutting these frequencies, especially in drums. But as you'll see, I found that the key to keeping the power and the fullness and meat in your mix is just not cutting too much of this. And by the way, when you need to add more fullness in these low, mid, and mid-range areas, turn to saturation, because they do it in a nice complementary harmonic way and add those kind of lower meaty frequencies, whereas boosting with EQ in these areas very quickly makes things muddy or honky. All right, so let's move up. Let's go to the 1K to 2.5K area. This is where you get a lot of the energy in your mix. That 1K area is really upfront to our ears, so if you want something to poke out of a mix to be more center stage, this is kind of the range to look at boosting. And 1K is more of that upfront, cut through the mix, kind of sit above the mix area. And then as you move closer to 2 and 2.5K, that's more of an aggressive, grindy character. And on drums, if you boost in the 2 to 2.5K area, you'll get kind of like a lower smack attack on it. Then at 3 to 5K, this area adds more edge to a sound. It helps it cut through the mix, but in a more aggressive way. It can also add some clarity to guitars and vocals as well. And on drums, it's more of an edge than the smack attack down at 2K. Between 3 and 5, you get more of an edgy attack. Then from 5 to 8K, this is where you might start using more broad shelves. I'll get into that shortly. This is where a lot of sibilance is on the vocal. It can also add clarity and energy to your high end of a bunch of different tracks. And I really love this range, especially around 8K, for something brightly soaring on top of the mix, like a lead guitar or a synth. The 8K area is also a great click attack for kick drums. You know, that metal, really pointy, bright kick drum attack, that's right at 8K. And that high-end poke-through attack, or kind of the bright crack of a snare drum, also 8K is a great range to look at there. And finally, up from there, anything above 8K, this is kind of just general brightness. Sometimes we like to call it air. It's kind of that breathy, not necessarily very defined brightness, but just kind of that breathy, airy brightness, and it just adds an overall lift to a track or a mix. So there's a quick breakdown of kind of the different frequency ranges that you're looking at as a mixer. Now, let's dive into different types of EQ. Now, first, we've got filters. Okay, and these are pretty simple. They're basically just filtering out anything below a certain point or above a certain point. So if you have a high pass filter at 100 hertz, that means that anything higher than 100 passes through. That's why it's called high pass. And then a low pass, let's say you have a low pass at 8K, well, that means everything lower than 8K passes through. Now, filters are kind of an aggressive tool because they just straight up filter off anything above or below a certain point, but they are extremely useful. You can cut out a lot of low-end rumble that you don't need, which leaves more space in your mix. You can cut out harsh high frequencies or filter them out to make something sound warmer and darker and further away. And then the more you bring these filters closer together and kind of really narrow down the frequency range of a track, well, that's when you start getting that telephone effect or that lo-fi radio sound. Then we've got EQ shelves. Now, a shelf is when you're boosting or cutting everything below a certain frequency. So filters, you're just filtering out everything below or above a certain point. Shelves, you're boosting or cutting below or above a certain point. And shelves, these are typically used kind of at the lower or higher extremes of the frequency range. They're more of a smooth EQ sound. You would use these for kind of broad strokes. For example, if you just want something to be brighter, well, then maybe you just use a shelf and turn up all the frequencies above 5 or 8 or 12K or wherever you need it. Not just that one specific area, but just kind of everything above there. And shelves are also sometimes more of a finisher move. Like you might add a little bit of extra low end or high end to a drum bus or to the whole mix, or you might take it away. Sometimes on a fat guitar or a vocal, they're just a little bit too bassy, and a little low shelf taking out frequencies below, let's say 200 hertz, is really effective. And then we've got a bell curve. Now, like I said, shelves are more kind of the high and low end focus of the frequency range. Bells are more for most of the EQing in the frequencies you find in the mid range, and you can be a lot more precise with these. You can target a specific frequency to boost or cut. You can be very surgical with some EQ plugins if you need to be, though I do advise against going searching for those things to surgically cut. Don't just solo every track and do a really narrow boost and then sweep it around to look for nastiness and then dip it out like you see we're on number 5 on the screen here. Sometimes you need to do that, but you should only do that if something is really poking out in a nasty way and bothering you. Then go find it and fix it. Don't just hit solo and go searching for ways to do this. And even though you can be very precise and surgical like that, you can still be broad too using the Q control. The Q control is just basically the width or the narrowness of your bell boost. And typically I'd be doing a broader, like a wider Q on an EQ boost. And then for an EQ cut, often it would be using a slightly tighter Q. Now I want to give you a bit of a warning. I've been showing you kind of the visual EQ graphs because it's very easy to kind of conceptualize in your mind. But look on the right here. This is a real EQ setting that I used in a mix of mine. And from the top down here, you can see on the SSL EQ, you're boosting a lot at 8K, boosting around 2K, cutting a lot around 300, and then boosting again at 60 Hertz at the bottom there. Now, if you mimic those moves on an EQ that gives you a visual graph like the one on the left here, it just looks so weird, right? We get thrown off by what our eyes see. You might look at this and be like, that's a really weird EQ curve. That doesn't look right. And so you might kind of start to question your moves. You might start to pull some of these things back so that it doesn't look so extreme. And that's why I really prefer using EQs that don't have this visual graph. That's why I use a ton of the SSL channel in my mixes, because you don't get distracted by what you're seeing. You just turn knobs until it sounds good, and it forces you to just use your ears to judge and not your eyes. And that doesn't mean that I never use the visual ones like the ones on the left there, but usually that's more for kind of zeroing in and making smaller, precise changes. But generally, I use the SSL channel. I find it more musical, it's more creative, it's more of a feel-based EQ, and that's what I'm using probably at least 90% of the time in my mixes. So little warning there. All right, so those are the foundations of EQ. And by the way, I have a mixing cheat sheet here you can download that has all of the go-to EQ starting points for each instrument in your mix. And that'll just help point you in the right direction, help you find the most common areas to work with when it comes to EQ for each track in your mix. All right, time to get serious here. We're getting into the nitty-gritty. Mixing foundations, compression. This is my favorite tool in the mix, compressor. And a friend of mine who used to work with me in the studio a little bit, he said, the more I mix, the more I realize that mixing pretty much is compression. Now, when you're done this training, I think you'll see what he means. Of course, there are a lot of other things going into mixing than just compression, but I think by the end of this and seeing some real world mixes come together, you're going to see why he said that. And I really do think compression is probably the most powerful tool we have in the mix. So before we get into why I think that, let's just cover the basics. What is a compressor? Well, a compressor just automatically turns down the signal based on a set threshold. It's like a really simple robot. You tell it, hey, when the signal gets above this level, turn it down. That's essentially what the compressor is doing. And so it helps us control the dynamics. And what are dynamics? Well, dynamics is just the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts of a sound. And when you start using compression, it kind of does some funny things to our minds. By turning down the loudest peaks in a song, well, it makes the quieter sections sound louder, which makes the overall track sound louder. So it's kind of a weird thing that actually something that is designed just to turn things down actually can make things sound louder. It's kind of interesting. It helps us make sure an instrument is heard well enough all the way through a track. For example, of course, a vocal, you want to hear all the words. You don't want to miss the quiet words, or you don't want to have a loud line really jump out and sound annoyingly loud. And this is really just the basic function of a compressor, but that's just scratching the surface. Before we go deeper, let's talk about all the controls on a compressor. First, we have the threshold, and the threshold is just the point at which the compressor will kick in and start turning down the signal. Now, in some compressors like this one on the screen, you control the threshold. In others, the threshold is just hardwired. It's just hard set at a certain level, and so you just control the input level going into the unit to control how much compression it's doing. So if you look where this red arrow is pointing here, that little line, you can see where the input signal is. Well, it's basically anything that crosses that line, that's when the compressor is going to kick in. This compressor, this is a distressor model here. There is no threshold control. It's just a hard set threshold. And so if you want to push the signal past the threshold, you turn up the input knob to feed more signal in, cross that threshold more, and thus compress more. So whether it's an input knob or a threshold knob, doesn't really matter. It essentially accomplishes the same thing. Next, let's talk about the ratio control. Now, this is sometimes a bit of a hard concept to wrap your head around. I'll try to explain it best I can. The ratio is essentially how aggressively the compressor attenuates the signal. So a 4-to-1 ratio means that for every 4 dB that the signal exceeds the threshold, it's only going to allow it to exceed by 1 dB. So yes, I know that's kind of confusing. Let me try to give you an example. So let's say you have a threshold of minus 10 dB. Okay, that's your threshold, and your ratio is 4-to-1. So minus 10 is your threshold, and your signal comes in at minus 6. Well, that minus 6 dB signal is exceeding that threshold by 4 dB. So the compressor's going to come in and it's going to say, okay, you're over by 4 dB, and I'm only allowed to have you be 1 dB over for every 4. So even though you came in at minus 6, I'm turning you down to minus 9 because that's all that's allowed. It's turning that 4 dB of extra level into only 1 dB of extra level. And at 8-to-1, it's turning 8 dB of extra level into only 1 dB of extra level. So you can see how that would naturally be more aggressive. I know it's kind of confusing to think about. Truthfully, it doesn't matter. You don't have to think about it in that way, like I just said. All you really need to know is that a lower ratio is gentler, more smooth, subtle compression, and higher ratios will sound more obvious and dramatic. And once you go above 10-to-1, that's classically considered limiting, and a brick wall limiter basically means nothing is getting past that threshold. It really just pins something down in place. The attack control determines how quickly the compressor will start reacting. For example, a 30 millisecond attack, well, that means that as soon as the signal crosses that threshold, it's going to wait 30 milliseconds, then start turning down the signal. And again, I want you to just simplify this in your mind to think about fast attack, medium attack, slow attack. So a fast attack grabs the signal very quickly, so that means it's going to reduce transients, right? Because it's going to kick in right away. Whereas a slower attack is going to allow more of the transient through before it clamps down. And here's where we really start getting into the magic and the power of compression. And remember how I said it kind of plays funny tricks on our ears? Well, when you let more transient through and then compress, what our ears actually hear is that you've emphasized the transient. And that's because relative to the rest of the signal, the transient is now louder. So that's why a slow attack on a compressor will make a snare drum or any type of drum sound more punchy. It's emphasized that transient by letting some through and then compressing the signal. So let me do a quick demo of attack time here for you. Let's listen to these drums. So here's a compressor on the drum bus. Let's go ahead and just crank up the compression. So I'm just going to turn down the threshold, which is going to mean there's going to be more compression. So right now we're at a 30 millisecond attack time, so it's letting a lot of those transients through. Let me mute our parallel smash compression bus here. Now if we use a faster attack time, watch, we're going to get more compression because it's going to start hitting the transients. Hear how it's really squashing those transients on the faster attacks. And then as we get slower, it's going to start letting more of those transients through. So when we get to 30 here, we can really hear kind of the full transient on the drums. And by the way, a good tip if you're kind of trying to set like what's the ideal attack time here, you can really just crank up the compression. So either really bring down that threshold a lot, so you're doing a lot of gain reduction, or turn up the input a lot, so you're doing a lot of gain reduction. And then you can kind of fiddle with the attack time and see where you're getting the right amount of transient through the compressor. And then you can dial it back to get the amount that you want. So that's just a tip for, it can be kind of subtle when you're doing only a little bit of compression. It's kind of hard to hear the different attack and release times. But if you really just crank it up, try to find those settings, and then dial it back and fine tune it after. So let me reset this here, and then I'll give you one more example. Let's go over to the snare drum. So this snare track is already compressed. But again, if we crank this up, now watch what happens if we go to really fast attack time. We lose the crack of the transient because it's getting all grabbed and turned down by the compressor. Now if we start to loosen it up, oh, now we have a little bit of attack coming through, but it still sounds a bit choked. Now we're hearing a lot of the transient come through. Even more. Then we can dial it back, find a more reasonable amount of compression. There we go. So that's a helpful way to kind of set the ideal attack time. Just crank it up, move the attack around until you find where you like it, and then dial back the compression. Then after attack, we've got release. And release is just how quickly the compressor returns or releases the signal back to its original volume. So a fast release is going to very quickly let the signal go back to its original level after it kicks in. So the signal hits the threshold, compressor kicks in based on ratio and attack time, and then with a fast release, it's just going to be like, boom, compress, and then give it right back. Whereas a slow release, it's going to return the signal to its original level more gradually, more slowly. So it kicks in, it compresses, and then it gently eases the signal back to where it was the longer the release time is. And again, you want to simplify this in your mind, all right? So a slower release, that just means it's going to have more of a smoother compression sound because it's changing the level less drastically. Whereas a faster release sounds more aggressive because the level's getting turned down and then it's getting returned back up very rapidly. The level's changing very quickly. So let's do a quick demo for you here using a drum room track. So right now, this compressor is at the fastest possible release time. You can see the meter here. It's letting go of the signal fairly quickly. That means we're kind of compressing the transients and then letting it go. So that's having the effect of kind of bringing up the ambience in between the drum hits. Now, if we slow down the release time, we lose that effect because it's not returning the signal fast enough. And this release gets really slow. Look at that. In fact, the release is so slow there that it's not even letting go before the next drum hit. We kind of lose that ambience because it's just turning down the signal that's just kind of staying down because it doesn't get a chance to fully release. And then if we bring it all the way back up, you get that ambience. So there's a quick demo of release time, and we'll dig into that a little more. I'll give you some more examples of that in a minute. Finally, we have the gain control or the output control on the compressor, and this is really just controlling the final output of the compressor, right? It's also called makeup gain sometimes, and essentially this is just there because a compressor is turning the signal down, so sometimes you need to turn it back up at the end to get it back to the level you need in the mix or the level that you need to go into the next plugin or into the next piece of gear. So pretty simple there. So yes, essentially a compressor is just a level control, and it certainly is very useful in controlling dynamics, making things more even, more audible, like we said. But this play between the ratio, the attack, and the release, this is where the magic is. And this is something that takes time and practice to really get a hold of. But let me illustrate just a few ways that compressors become the most powerful sonic shaping tool in the mix. All right, we already talked about emphasizing transients, right? Especially common in drums with a slow attack time, letting that transient through before it compresses. But what if you do the opposite? Well, I just kind of showed you and gave you an example on a drum room track, but what would happen if you had a fast attack and a fast release on the drum room track? Well, if you think it through, it's going to clamp down on those transients with the fast attack, then it's going to let it go immediately. And so that means that the sound in between the hits gets louder. And the result is that the character and the ambience of the room is now emphasized, right? Transients reduced, ambience increased. So that's why heavy compression on room tracks, drum room tracks, is very common. It's because with a compressor, we can actually increase the amount of ambience and natural reverb that we hear in a track. It can actually make a room sound bigger. So what would happen if you had a fast attack and a slower release, or a medium to slow release? Well, you're going to have the initial transient be softened by that fast attack and reduced. Then the level's going to kind of gradually, smoothly return back to normal. And the result of that is that it's going to sound a little further away. It's going to be pushed back in the mix. So think about a drum or a tambourine. If it's in the room 2 feet away from you, those transients, every single hit sounds really loud. It's like a big hit, every hit is a big spike hitting your ears, right? But if you take that same tambourine or drum and put it 20 feet away from you, well, that spike kind of dissipates, right? It's not like a big, it's not hitting our ears as hard. And so that's how you can use attack time to reduce transients, and it actually has the effect of pushing things back in the mix. So you can use fast attack to push things back. You can use slower attacks to enhance those transients and bring things more up front and more forward in the mix. I love to do that on vocal tracks. So if you have a kind of a fast to medium attack, just enough to let the start of the word get through before it starts compressing, and then a fast release on a vocal, well, the compressor kicks in right after the start of the word gets through, and now the start of the word now sounds louder than the rest because you've kind of emphasized that transient or that attack of the vocal. And so the result of that is, voila, the vocal sounds more intense, more upfront because those consonants are emphasized. And if you go and listen to any mainstream rock or pop song, listen to how much the consonants, those C's, those T's, the p, the t, t, those consonants really just jump out of the speakers. And this makes the vocals sound so much more energetic. It makes it sound like the singer singing 10 times harder than they actually were. And that heavy vocal compression, like doing a lot of gain reduction in this way, it also means that the breaths in between, the space in between the words gets emphasized. So do all the really subtle, low-level characteristics of how the vocal sounds. So that's why heavy compression on a vocal is really an amazing tool to bring out all the feeling and uniqueness of a singer. And you're going to hear that in action across all of my mixes in this training. So now I hope you're starting to grasp really the true power of compression. And it's beyond just a level control. It's like a character control. You can mellow a sound out, or you can make it more aggressive. You can bring it up front, or you can push it back in the mix. And so you want to really experiment with different compressors for different flavors. And we'll touch on some flavors real quick. So in the days of hardware compressors before plugins, these compressors were built with different components inside them, which would all sound different, right? Like tubes versus solid state transistors. I don't really know that much about the hardware components or how they work and all the really nerdy tech stuff behind it. I just know that different materials make different sounds. And a bunch of these older hardware compressors or current hardware compressors, they also had hardwired thresholds or attack and release times. And so they therefore became go-tos for certain things in the mix. Now I'll give you just a few examples. The 1176, it's got a fixed threshold, and that's why we have the input knob there. But you do have a ratio control, so you can really get more aggressive with the compressor up to 12, or 8 to 12 to 20 to 1. And you do have attack and release controls on this, but even if you've got attack and release controls on a compressor, the range of that attack and release can be different on every compressor, right? So a slow attack on an 1176 is still kind of a fast attack compared to other compressors. Now this blue version of the 1176, it's known to have more of an aggressive sound. It adds a certain saturation and subtle distortion to the signal. So sometimes you're using compression to do a whole bunch of things, right? It's controlling the level, it's affecting the shape and the aggression of it, but then it's also adding more size and more character with whatever type of saturation that it's doing. Here's another popular one, the LA2A. It's got a fixed threshold, just an input and an output gain control, fixed attack and release, fixed ratio, and actually the way this compressor works is actually wired to kind of have different ratios in attack and release based on the signal that's coming in. So that's kind of interesting too. This has been a favorite for many years on bass and vocals. To my ears, it's a fairly smooth level control. Doesn't really go super aggressive in the way I like, but it can control level nicely. Whereas the LA3A has a faster attack. It also adds some really nice mid-range saturation and fullness, so I love it on electric guitars. And of course, what I'm showing here are plugin models of old hardware units. I'm showing the Waves ones here, but almost every plugin company out there has their own models of these compressors. And there are tons more examples. Those are just a few for you that I commonly use in my mixes and that you'll see throughout this training. Remember, there are no rules. Okay, try out different compressors. See what they do. You'll start to get a favorite for certain things. And many of these compressors are just tried and true across decades, right? Like the SSL channel compressor sounds great on drums. The 1176 sounds great on vocals, etc. Like I just said, the LA3A sounds great on electric guitars. So you can follow what I'm using in the training here to get started, and you'll get great results, right? Because they're tried and true. They've been loved and used for decades on certain instruments, certain compressors on certain tracks. And even if you don't hear all the subtleties right away, just keep using them, keep doing what I show you here. And over time, things will just start to fall into place and start to click for you. So there you have it, the foundation of compression. All right, time to talk about saturation and distortion, another one of your main mixing weapons. So what is saturation? Well, it's essentially a subtle distortion, right? And when it comes to our saturation plugins, it's often modeled from physical gear, like tape, tubes, and transistors, how they affect the harmonic makeup of a sound. For example, tape, it has kind of a reputation for smoothing things off, sometimes adding low-end warmth and soaking up some high-end. Because as you saturated tape, i.e. put louder signals into it, it had a natural compression and distortion that it added. And all these different materials and different gear through the years produced a different type of distortion and saturation. And essentially what it's doing is it's creating harmonics around the original source signal, which means it kind of has the effect of thickening it and fattening it. And like I said in the first mixing weapons video, I like to reach for saturation when I like how something sounds, so I don't really want to EQ it, but I just want it to be more of what it already is. I want it to take up more space in the mix and be a little bit bigger and richer. Some types of saturation can also smooth things over. It can take harsh high frequencies and make them sound smoother by kind of padding around it with complementary frequencies. And also, depending on the type of distortion or saturation, it can also sometimes make things sound more aggressive. And distortion is really just kind of at the extreme end. And this is really aggressively limiting dynamic range because it's basically just chopping off the peaks of the waveform, and that's why you get the distortion. So distortion can be used, obviously, to add aggression to a track. You can really get creative and kind of blend distortion in parallel. For example, let's say a scream vocal, if you want it to sound more aggressive, you can duplicate it, distort it with like a guitar style distortion, and then blend that in underneath just subtly. You can also do the same thing on drums to add a lot of energy and aggression to a drum track. And distortion is really the ultimate loudness tool, right? It generates tons of harmonics, which makes things sound louder. It eliminates or reduces the peaks and valleys of a sound. So you're going to see in detail, once you dive into the real world sessions, how this gets used in creative ways for aggression, for energy, for loudness, and even for dynamic control on everything from a snare drum to a piano track to vocals. These are just a few of my personal favorite saturation plugins. The one on the top left is Massey Tapehead. That's a great one for kind of smoothing things over, fattening up the mid-range. Below that, there's Soundtoys Decapitator. This is definitely one of my go-to saturation plugins. It's got a few different styles and flavors built in there. It can be subtle if you don't go above that one position on the drive knob. It can also get nice and aggressive too. In the middle here is the Slate Virtual Mix Rack modules. We've got New York, London, Hollywood, just based on different pieces of gear. Those do a nice job of different flavors of saturation. In the bottom right, we've got Crane Song Phoenix. This is a Pro Tools only plugin, but man, it is really great at thickening stuff up in a really kind of subtle musical way. And then in the top right there, we've got the Escalator. This is actually a plugin that I'm developing under my new plugin brand. As of the time right now, I'm filming this video. It's just in the final stages of testing, but hopefully when you're watching this, you'll be able to pick it up. I think this is, it's going to be a secret weapon. It sounds amazing on drums. It sounds amazing on really anything, bass guitar, vocals, and it really adds a nice, rich, kind of fattening style of saturation in a way that doesn't sound muddy at all, and it also doesn't affect the transients in a negative way. So it kind of thickens up a sound around the transients, keeping those nice transients intact, so you're kind of saturating without ruining the attack of a transient. So that's basically what saturation is, what it does, and a few of my favorite tools. All right, our final lesson in the mixing foundations, effects, right? Delays, reverbs, chorus, flanger, all the other wacky stuff we can do to a sound. And effects just help us create space. And we do that by mimicking real world scenarios. And in the real world, sound always interacts with the environment that it's making the sound in, right? That's why a bone dry vocal sounds really out of place in the mix and kind of feels uncomfortable, unnatural, because we don't hear singers like that in real life, right? So reverbs, they can create the illusion of something being recorded or heard in a certain space. And delay is similar. Chorus and flangers and those things, they usually work by varying the pitch up and down to create unique effects and combining that with different timing and whatnot. So we'll kind of dive into each one of these quickly. I'm going to start with delay because, well, most kind of beginner amateur mixers, when they're starting out, it's all about reverb, right? It's all about reverb because in solo, if you solo something and put reverb on it, pretty much everything sounds better with reverb, right? But for me and for a lot of other pros I know, delay is really the go-to effect in the mix because too much reverb can really make a mix cloudy, can sound like there's a blanket over the mix. It takes up a lot of space and kind of just sounds amateur very quickly when you use too much reverb. Whereas delays, because they're usually timed to the rhythm of the song, they tend to blend in a lot better. And to my ears, you can add depth in a way that doesn't really mask the other elements in the mix the way reverb does. So on vocals, I like to use a short kind of slap style delay. That basically means that you have a really short delay time. So the original sound comes and then the delay echoes come really quickly and it's just one echo. So it doesn't keep going on and on and on and on and on like a delay like that. It just kind of slaps and echoes back once and that's it. And that kind of mimics a really clean small room ambience. Then you can have really long delays with more feedback, more repeats, and that creates a bigger kind of more lush ambient sound. And you can also use darker delays. So you can just kind of use a low pass filter to filter out the high end of the delay echoes, which is going to push the delay sound back in the mix and create more depth, more space between the original sound and the delay trail. So I use delays a lot on lead guitars, on synths, on vocals, on background vocals, anything that's kind of melodic. I really love delays. When we think about it, kind of the more percussive something is, I would lean more towards reverb because having a delay on something percussive can become really distracting, right? But on a melodic track, it's very smooth, very lush. It sits things in the mix in a really nice, clean way. And when it comes to reverb then, I kind of think of that as helping to fill the space and to also mimic different spaces. And so you can lengthen sounds with reverb. And of course you can do that with delay too, but reverb can do it better on percussive instruments. For example, drums. You're going to use a reverb to kind of lengthen that tail versus a delay. I also use reverbs to mimic real environments. Like I said, for example, let's say I tracked an acoustic singer-songwriter, just an acoustic guitar and a vocal, and I've recorded them in a really dry space separately. Well, then I would probably create a room reverb, kind of a reverb that is mimicking a small room sound, and then sending both the guitar and the vocal track to that small room reverb to make it sound like they're singing and playing at the same time in a small room. Or at the other end of the spectrum, you could have a string track, a string section, send that to a big long plate or a big hall reverb because those instruments sound really rich and full with these long reverb tails, and that's a sound that we're all used to hearing too. And you can also use reverb as kind of a special effect. You can create really huge, snare cannon shots with reverb. You can make something sound really larger than life. And you can also make a powerful vocal, like a ballad vocal. You can make it sound very epic with a longer, kind of richer reverb, as long as there's enough space in the arrangement and in the mix for it. So typically I'd use reverbs on drums and percussion, acoustic guitars. Acoustic guitars are kind of a percussive sounding instrument, so that's why, again, I'm leaning towards reverbs instead of delays. Use it a lot on strings and other acoustic instruments, keys, pianos, again, also kind of percussive, and on some vocals, right? And background vocals if I want them to kind of sound a little further back in the mix, and on lead vocals if there's more space and it's more of a sparse arrangement. But typically you'll see me lean heavily and kind of favor heavily delays over reverbs in most cases in the mixes that I do, and I think that's going to become evident as to why as you, again, start diving into the real world mixes in this training. And finally, to wrap things up really quick, courses, flangers, etc. These are not something that you'll use a ton, probably. I don't use them a ton, but they can help you create width. For example, if you have a mono vocal, you can send it to a chorus that is giving you a slightly different pitch on the left and the right, and that's going to help spread that vocal out a little bit. You can do that with guitars and other melodic instruments as well. And then you can also just use these effects to add interesting texture and uniqueness to your track. Just crafting certain sounds, creating an effect that's kind of ear-catching, something unique in your song that's beyond just a normal guitar or vocal tone. And it really is just a sound effect, right? It's not so much a must-have mix tool, it's more of an effect. And the last thing I want to say is just that you want to find your go-to effects and stick with them for the most part. And you'll see this, you'll see me using templates that have the same reverbs and delays with the same settings in them. Picture if you were still mixing, on a big console with all outboard gear, right, before DAWs. Well, you'd have a limited amount of hardware reverbs and hardware delays, and each one of them would probably just do one thing really well, and they'd probably just stay on those settings. And so you might have maybe 2 or 3 reverbs, 2 or 3 delays, and those are kind of just the same all the time. And every mix you do, you're just sending tracks to those same effects as needed. And you can really take the same approach mixing in the box as well, all right? You don't need to be auditioning and shooting out reverbs every single time you mix, okay? Find ones that sound good, that you like, that work, and then just stick with them, put them in your template. And funny enough, early on when I was a beginner mixer and amateur mixer, I spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect reverb, whereas now I've got 2 or 3 settings on the same reverb plugin, and that's pretty much all I use. I just stick with that when it comes to reverb. And finally, just to separate in your mind all these other tools we talked about versus reverb and delay and other effects, in terms of getting energy, in terms of having your mixes translate, getting power, getting clarity in the mix, it's all about those other tools, right? Your fader, your pan knob, EQ, compression, saturation. And then the effects that I mentioned here, reverbs, delays, these are just the sweeteners, okay? These are the icing on top. All right, so that covers your mixing foundations, all the go-to weapons that you're gonna use as a mixer. And these foundational lessons are short on purpose because, look, you're not gonna really learn how to use these tools by just watching a kind of a classroom style lesson like this. You've gotta see these things in action in real world, real life mixes for real bands, real clients, and then get your hands on those tracks and start playing with these tools yourself.